Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's often been left out of history's spotlight. A world shaped not just by cannons and treasure maps, but by women who dared to rebel in ways that shook the systems around them. You've heard stories about pirates, sure, but tonight we're going to explore what happened when those pirates were women. Women who sailed, fought, cursed like sailors, and challenged the very fabric of the societies that tried to tame them. And things didn't just get interesting when they were at sea. It's what happened after they got caught that truly unraveled the expectations of their time. Before we set off, take a second to settle in. If you're a fan of stories that dive into the forgotten corners of history, feel free to subscribe, but only if you mean it. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a strange joy seeing this little community stretch across time zones. Maybe dim the lights, maybe grab a drink, maybe turn on a fan for that faint hum in the background. Wherever you are, we're in this together now. Let's begin. When a pirate was caught, and most were eventually, the path forward was straightforward. A quick trial, a grim rope, a crowd hungry for drama, and a body swinging in the breeze. But that script unraveled the moment the condemned wasn't a rough-faced man in a coat, but a woman, perhaps still wearing breeches, perhaps smirking as she stood in court. The 17th and 18th centuries had answers for theft, for heresy, for marrying the wrong cousin, but not for women who led pirate crews and wielded swords with unapologetic skill. There were no tidy instructions for that. Imagine the scene. A pirate stands unmasked, and beneath the dirt and gunpowder, it's revealed she's a woman. The courtroom, stiff with powdered wigs and rigid morality, freezes. Silence thickens. The judges glance at each other, fumbling through ancient legal texts for a clause that simply doesn't exist. There's no section titled "Women who led pirate raids and refused to apologize." And so the confusion begins. The murmurs rise. Is she mad? Possessed? Is this all a clever trick, a performance, a joke played by fate? The law, which ran like clockwork for male pirates, jammed like gears full of sand when faced with someone like her. One of the first questions would inevitably be, where is her husband? Because it couldn't be possible, not in their world, that a woman had chosen this life of violence and defiance all by herself. The fault had to lie with some man, or with the devil, or both. It couldn't be that she had simply taken her own destiny by the throat and wrestled it into submission. Some courts panicked and stuck with what they knew. They sentenced her to hang. Others hesitated. Perhaps it was the sensation her capture stirred in the papers. Perhaps it was the silent fear that hanging a woman with a pistol and a grin might stir sympathy instead of submission. Or maybe it was just too hard to explain to their superiors how they'd executed someone for the crime of courage and trousers. And so these women, these female pirates, often became anomalies, relics of confusion, both feared and fascinating. Some were hanged, some were imprisoned, others, well, that's the journey we're going to follow. Let's begin with one of the most infamous. Anne Bonny. Irish by birth, flame-haired, fearless, and as quick with her wit as she was with a blade. When she was finally apprehended in the Caribbean in 1720, many expected her to break down, to plead, to weep, to find some semblance of repentance tucked in the folds of femininity society demanded she wear. But Anne didn't flinch. Standing in court beside her partner in piracy, Mary Read, she listened to the sentence of death without blinking. Then she stared straight at the judge and said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." Not exactly the kind of line you stitch onto a sampler. But Anne wasn't finished. She had one more move. She told the court she was pregnant. And in the strange logic of British law, that changed everything. You couldn't hang a woman carrying a child, not out of mercy necessarily, but out of some arcane rule about not executing two souls with one rope. It was called pleading the belly, and Anne invoked it with perfect timing. Whether she truly was expecting or not, no one checked. There was no midwife's affidavit. Just her word, and that was enough to delay the noose. As for what happened after that delay, that's where the fog of history settles in. Some say her wealthy father pulled strings. Some say she escaped. Others claim she simply faded into the prison records and then out of them, vanishing like a ship swallowed by fog. But one fact remains. She didn't hang. And in the brutal arithmetic of pirate justice, that alone is a victory. Her clever legal move sparked something unusual. Suddenly, pleading the belly wasn't just a desperate excuse, it became strategy. In trial after trial, female pirates used it to claw back time, to escape death's grip for just a little longer, and sometimes that little time was enough to change everything. We'll dive deeper into that next, with Mary Read and the quiet end that stood in sharp contrast to Anne's blazing defiance. If Anne Bonny was fire, then Mary Read was forged iron. Where Anne seethed with fury and flame, Mary held steady like a blade honed over years of battle. Quiet, practical, and built for survival, Mary didn't care for theatrics. She didn't posture or spit clever lines in court. She simply endured, with the cold resolve of someone who had spent her entire life passing as someone else. Mary had sailed disguised as a man for most of her career. That wasn't unusual for the time. It was necessary. Many ships refused to allow women aboard, citing superstition, temptation, or the old fear that a single female on deck would doom the voyage. So Mary concealed her identity beneath loose clothes and hardened muscle. She fought beside men who never suspected or who didn't ask. And when she stood trial, like Anne, she used the same trick. She claimed she was pregnant. It worked. The court, faced once again with that uncomfortable legal loophole, postponed her execution. But this time, the story didn't end with escape or redemption. It ended in shadows. The prison cells of colonial Jamaica were no place for survival. Dark, damp, and infested, they were little more than disease factories with iron bars. Mary, already weakened by the hardships of piracy and possibly by the pregnancy itself, fell ill. The records are silent on the exact cause. Maybe typhus, maybe dysentery, maybe the complications of carrying a child in filth and fear. No midwife came, no physician treated her. She simply vanished, not into legend, but into the quiet death of a nameless cell. There's no heroic escape, no dramatic courtroom speech, no last-minute rescue by a sympathetic noble. Just fever, decay, and the silent crumble of a woman who had fought her whole life only to be buried not with ceremony, but with indifference. In a way, Mary's death was the mirror opposite of her pirate life. On the open sea, she had been bold, free, and dangerous. In captivity, she became a footnote. She didn't leave behind a ballad or a headline, only the murmur of a name, slipping through the cracks of history. And yet her story still echoes, not in victory, but in the reminder that even the fiercest can fall, not in battle, but in bureaucratic neglect. And still, these weren't the only women who turned the tide. Across the globe, as Mary Read lay dying in a rotting cell, another woman was rewriting the rules of piracy entirely. Not through trial or trickery, but through sheer, audacious mastery. Her name was Ching Xue, and unlike Anne or Mary, she never got caught. Where the Caribbean pirates danced between legality and legend, Ching Xue orchestrated a floating empire. In early 19th century China, she commanded a fleet so vast it made most European navies look like amateur boating clubs. At her peak, she oversaw hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of pirates. Some records claim as many as 80,000 men answered to her, a number that may be inflated, but the fear she inspired was not. She didn't skulk in shadows. She negotiated from strength. As Chinese imperial forces, Portuguese warships, and British merchant vessels all scrambled to stop her, Qingxie walked straight into the governor's palace in Guangdong and offered terms. Not surrender, terms. She demanded full pardons for her fleet, the right to keep her loot, and, astonishingly, immunity from prosecution. And she got it. Imagine that, the state bending to a pirate. Not because they couldn't catch her, though they couldn't, but because they realized that dealing with her was safer than fighting her. She walked away with her fortune, her reputation, and her life intact. She didn't swing from a rope or rot in a cell. She retired, opened a gambling house, lived well into old age. Qingxie's story is a strange contradiction. She was the exception to nearly every rule. She was never captured, never imprisoned, never tried. And yet her legacy stands as proof that piracy, real, brutal piracy, didn't belong solely to men with beards and rum bottles. It could belong to a woman with strategy, discipline, and the audacity to win. She didn't escape justice. She negotiated her way past it. Her success didn't just expose the weaknesses of imperial systems. It revealed a different truth, that sometimes the most dangerous pirate in the world is the one who never needs to raise her voice or fire a shot. The one who simply knows how the world works and how to make it work for her. And still, even Qingxie wasn't the end of the story. Because if courts couldn't execute a woman, and if they couldn't imprison her indefinitely, and if, heaven forbid, she escaped altogether, what did they do next? The answer, surprisingly, was both absurd and revealing. When all else failed, they tried to reform her. Once the courts failed to hang her and the prisons proved too messy or inconvenient, society turned to its final, most baffling tactic. Reform. Because nothing tames a sea-hardened woman, apparently, like needlework. This wasn't redemption in the spiritual sense. It wasn't about saving her soul or guiding her back to morality. It was optics. Pure performance. The message was clear. A woman who once commanded men and cannons, who looted ships and cursed the crown, would now sit quietly in a parlor and embroider flowers onto handkerchiefs. Transformation, in this case, meant domestication. Some were placed in religious institutions, convents where they were expected to pray, repent, and forget the taste of salt air and stolen gold. Others were confined to reformatories or homes for fallen women, a euphemism as cruel as it was vague. These were places built on silence, shame, and the constant dull hum of guilt. Not justice, not protection. Containment. Reform meant erasure. The pirate spirit, wild, vulgar, insubordinate, had to be extinguished. Not just for the woman's sake, but for the society she had offended by existing outside the bounds of expectation. Her crime, after all, wasn't just theft. It was visibility. It was independence. And so, the system didn't just seek to punish. It sought to overwrite. But not all women complied. Some sat through sermons and needlepoint lessons with polite smiles and sharp thoughts. They played along, quietly planning the next move. There were stories, half-whispered and poorly documented, of reformed women who slipped away in the night, cut their hair, donned trousers again, and vanished back into the anonymity of dockside cities. Others stayed ashore and ran their homes like ships, structured, loud, and occasionally armed. Still, there was one path of escape even more insidious than forced repentance, and it came dressed in lace and vows. Marriage. Yes, when all else failed, the state sometimes decided that the most efficient way to neutralize a female pirate was to hand her over to a husband. Because what better way to domesticate a criminal than through holy matrimony? It was absurd. But it happened. The logic was twisted. A woman who had terrorized trade routes could surely be subdued by chores, children, and a man with strong opinions about supper. Perhaps she'd grow weary of rebellion after a few years of laundry and loveless routine. Perhaps her sword arm would dull from cradling babies. Perhaps, and this was the state's secret hope, she would simply vanish into obscurity. Some women accepted. Not out of love, but out of calculation. If the choices were death, lifelong imprisonment, or becoming someone's wife, the latter offered the most flexibility. Some played the role convincingly, stirring porridge instead of mutiny, hiding blades beneath bread boxes. Others married fellow pirates, a romantic disaster waiting to happen, but arguably better than marrying a merchant. There were even cases of legal deals. Testify against your crew, betray the brotherhood, and in return, enjoy a pardon and a proper home with a man approved by the court. It wasn't justice. It was a compromise. A scandal wrapped in domesticity, but make no mistake. This wasn't about love or forgiveness. It was control. The system didn't want rehabilitation. It wanted obedience. It wanted these women silenced, hidden behind garden fences and petticoats, safely removed from the stage of history. And yet, despite their best efforts, society couldn't look away. Because even in captivity, these women remained a spectacle. The public fascination didn't fade. It grew. And so, the final act of every female pirate story wasn't written in the courtroom or the prison. It was written in ink, in gossip, in the pages of newspapers and pamphlets that flew off the presses like cannonballs. Their stories were distorted, dramatized, turned into cautionary tales, or worse, into caricatures. But sometimes the stories backfired. The women who were meant to frighten ended up inspiring, and no matter how much ink the courts spilled trying to define them, none of it could ever quite erase the truth of who they were. When a woman stepped into the courtroom accused of piracy, she didn't just bring chains, she brought an audience. The moment word spread that the defendant was not a burly, toothless man, but a woman with fire in her eyes and salt in her blood, the press exploded. Printing houses churned out pamphlets faster than broadsides from a warship. The titles were breathless, the stories lurid. And the truth? That was optional. They were branded with headlines like Harlot of the High Seas or She-Devil in Breeches. Some pamphlets painted them as seductresses lured into sin by rum and rogue captains. Others cast them as monstrous, unnatural women who stabbed for sport and cursed like devils. Either way, it sold. Female pirates became instant tabloid stars. Not because people cared about justice, but because scandal has always been currency. The courts were trapped. Execute her, and you risked martyrdom. Spare her, and you looked weak. Either way, someone would be angry. And while the judges fumbled with law books and ethics, the streets buzzed with gossip. People showed up to trials not to see justice served, but to catch a glimpse of the pirate woman, to hear her speak, to judge her posture, to see if she smiled. And speak she did. Some mocked the judges with sharp, fearless words. Others offered clever testimony laced with dark humor or unapologetic truth. They didn't beg. They didn't shrink. They stood, shoulders back, and said what they came to say. One accused pirate famously scolded the priest delivering her last rites for being dull. Another winked at her hangman. It wasn't just defiance. It was performance. One last act before the final curtain dropped. And the audience ate it up. But fame is a fickle tide. Public sympathy could turn in an instant. One false word, one poorly timed smirk, and the same crowd cheering for your bravery would demand your executions the next day. The press helped build these women up, but it was just as eager to tear them down. And for every Anne Bonny who became a legend, there were countless others lost in the footnotes. These forgotten women didn't die with drama. They disappeared in silence. No pamphlets, no ballads, no scandal sheets, just short lines in prison records. Woman taken at sea. Female accomplice, unidentified. No names, no details, Just bureaucracy trying to stuff a complicated life into a box it couldn't label. Many of these women weren't even pirates in the traditional sense. Some were wives or lovers of sailors, swept into the life by necessity. Others boarded ships in disguise just to survive, discovering they were better with a blade than they ever were behind a tavern counter. They weren't all born rebels, but once caught, they were judged the same. And when they didn't fit the mold, when they weren't loud or violent or interesting enough, history simply erased them. The archives are full of vague notations. A woman executed with no record of her trial. A female prisoner buried in an unmarked grave. A court case mentioning an unnamed woman in breeches. These ghosts of piracy remain, not in legend, but in the gaps. In the stories we never told because they made the storytellers uncomfortable. They didn't get their tales written in books. They didn't become Halloween costumes or bold Wikipedia entries. They were left behind, unacknowledged, inconvenient, and tragically human. But their silence still speaks. It tells us that history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we choose to remember. And the women erased from the pages, those who weren't colorful enough, or lucky enough, or defiant enough, deserve more than a blank space. They deserve to be acknowledged for what they were. Evidence that women didn't just sail through history. Sometimes they steered it. Suppose the courts didn't hang her. Suppose prison was too temporary, too filled with scandal, or too expensive to maintain. Suppose she wasn't married off like a package needing an owner. What then? What was left? Reformation. The state's last-ditch effort to mold a pirate into a proper woman. Take someone who once commanded a ship, issued orders with the certainty of thunder, and tried to teach her embroidery. It was less punishment and more transformation through enforced banality. They believed that if you confined a pirate's body long enough and buried her in boredom, her spirit would surrender. Some were sent to convents. These weren't havens of spiritual growth. They were quiet cages filled with incense, judgment, and needlework. Other women ended up in state-run asylums or homes for the morally wayward, surrounded by gray walls and grayer ideals. There, they were taught humility, silence, and how to forget the sea. Repentance was expected. Redemption was measured in stitched linens and bowed heads. Religion played a starring role, not because the system cared about salvation, but because it gave structure to punishment. A woman who had looted ships and left captains bleeding could supposedly wash all that away with scripture and sewing. Memorize enough psalms, they believed, and your past would disappear, or at least become palatable to those writing the public record. But not every woman reformed. Some sat through sermons nodding politely, already planning their exit. They stitched with obedient fingers and rebellious minds. The spirit that once braved cannon fire didn't die in a needlepoint class. It waited, it watched. And when the moment came, when a guard looked away, when a door creaked open, it acted. There were whispers of women who escaped, changed names, cut their hair short again, and found passage on new ships. Others didn't need the sea. They ran households like naval vessels, structured, efficient, always one step from mutiny. The pirate never left them, it just adapted. It wore an apron, carried a broom, and hid a knife behind the flour jar. And then there was another, often overlooked route. A quieter rebellion, a strategic choice, speak up, not to protest, but to betray. Snitching, the most unromantic escape route a pirate could take, but one of the most effective. When a female pirate offered names, routes, secrets, when she revealed where the gold was buried and which port turned a blind eye on Thursday nights, the authorities listened. Information was power, and power could mean survival. Some women traded loyalty for life. They gave up former crewmates to save themselves. Others exaggerated, invented entire smuggling rings, claimed they once sailed with legends just to buy a few more days of breath. A few even turned informant full-time, helping naval forces track down old friends. Cold? Maybe. But effective? Absolutely. Snitching wasn't always a guaranteed escape. Some gave everything they knew and still met the noose. But others walked out free. Identities erased. Futures rewritten. They disappeared into fishing towns or inland villages, carrying only memories and a new name. It wasn't heroic, but piracy was never about heroism. It was about survival, and sometimes survival meant knowing when to draw your sword and when to talk instead. For those who weren't clever enough to escape, or persuasive enough to plead pregnancy, or useful enough to bribe with secrets, the gallows remained. The ultimate spectacle, a ritual of control draped in moral performance. And when the condemned pirate was a woman, the drama multiplied tenfold. Public executions in the 18th century weren't grim affairs whispered about in dark corners. They were events. Vendors sold snacks, families gathered, children perched on shoulders to get a better view. It was part festival, part theater, part warning. And when the figure climbing the scaffold wore a dress, or worse, trousers and defiance, the crowds swelled. A woman swinging from a rope wasn't just a death. It was a statement. This is what happens, the authorities declared. This is the price of stepping out of line. Her crime wasn't just piracy. It was independence. The crowd wasn't only there for blood. They were there to see a system reassert itself. But not all went as planned. Some women met the gallows with silence, eyes straight ahead, no tears. Others wept or sang hymns or cursed the priest for being too slow. A few managed a final insult to the judge, the crowd, or the entire state. One legend tells of a pirate who, just before the drop, turned to her executioner and said, "Make it quick, I've places to be." The crowd, meant to be sobered, often left murmuring admiration. The performance backfired. Instead of fear, it stirred awe. Instead of silence, it sparked whispers. Some even walked away wondering not if justice had been served, but why such women had to die at all. The courts couldn't control the afterimage. Because while the rope killed the body, it often birthed the myth. And once a woman became myth, she couldn't be silenced. After the hanging, or the prison sentence, or the mysterious disappearance, the story didn't end. If anything, it began again, reshaped not by the women themselves, but by those who wrote history, mostly men. Men who loved moral lessons, men who feared complexity. They took these pirates and reworked them like soft clay. If she died young, she was painted as a tragic seductress led astray. If she survived, she became a warning. If she outwitted the law, she was labeled a freak, a curiosity, never simply capable. Facts were buried beneath fantasy. Anne Bonny became a rum-soaked caricature with a cutlass and a temper. Mary Read was reduced to her partnership with Anne, her own fire dimmed. Ching Shu became a mystical threat, her intelligence flattened into stereotype. Other women, nameless in the records, became fictional pirate queens, recycled across novels and poems, forever punished in the final act. Because the one thing worse than a dangerous woman was a victorious one. Yet as time passed, the message blurred. The same stories meant to discourage suddenly inspired. People read about these pirates and didn't see villains. They saw power, resistance, the freedom to defy expectations and write their own endings. They became something else, symbols of rebellion, of survival, of the uncomfortable truth that history's boundaries were more fragile than it liked to admit. So while the courts tried to erase them, and the writers tried to reshape them, and the crowds tried to judge them, these women remained, not always in name, but in presence, loud, brash, complicated, and deeply, gloriously inconvenient. So now you might be wondering, why weren't there more of them? Why do we know the names of a few and almost nothing about the rest? Was piracy really such a male-dominated world, or were the women simply erased? The truth is both simpler and more infuriating. There were likely far more female pirates than the history books admit. But history, like the ships they sailed, was built by men, for men. And for centuries, it was maintained that way. At sea, women weren't just discouraged, they were banned. Superstition ruled the waves, and sailors believed a woman aboard a ship would curse the voyage, distract the crew, and bring bad luck. Apparently, entire naval careers could be undone by the presence of a female voice, even if that voice was shouting orders more competently than any man on deck. So those who joined the crews had to become invisible. Trousers, flattened chests, lowered voices. They bound themselves into new identities and lived in disguise. A slip could mean exposure. Exposure could mean death. If discovered, they weren't praised for courage. They were shamed, thrown overboard, accused of seduction or witchcraft. Even pirates, those so-called rebels of the seas, held on to their misogyny like a treasured compass. And if a woman did rise in rank, if she commanded respect, it was often explained away. She was a fluke, a freak, a mistake. Her story became legend, and then cautionary tale, and finally, silence. Men who committed mass murder on the high seas were given nicknames and biographies, their faces carved onto pub signs, their deaths commemorated with poems. But a woman who did the same was treated like an aberration, or worse, an insult. Even the legal system didn't know what to do with her. Official records often reduced her to wife of pirate or female companion, as if to say that her existence was only valid through her relationship to a man. Her crimes weren't just criminal, they were inappropriate. Her rebellion wasn't revolutionary, it was impolite. And so they buried her story, literally and figuratively. No grave markers, no songs, just anonymous mentions in prison logs or faded court transcripts. No family tree, no folklore, no myth to pass down. Only gaps. Gaps that make it seem like she was never there to begin with. But she was. She was on the ships, in the fights, in the storms. She was there, cutting sail and cutting throats. Not always for glory, sometimes just to live, sometimes for revenge, sometimes because it was the only way out. The difference is, history wasn't ready for her. It didn't know how to include a woman with a sword, a crew, and no interest in being saved. So it chose to forget. What happened after a female pirate was captured wasn't just a matter of law. It was a mirror reflecting everything society feared about women who stepped outside the lines. Some were hanged, some died in filthy cells. Others cut deals, escaped, or faded into legend. But the real story is not just what happened to them, it's what their treatment revealed about the world around them. These women weren't punished simply because they stole or killed or sailed where they shouldn't. Men did those things all the time. The difference was expectation. Men were supposed to be violent, ambitious, hungry for power. Women weren't. And when a woman claimed that space, when she commanded, fought, refused to beg, it broke the narrative. Their capture wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about containment. Not of crime, but of possibility. Every step of the system, the trial, the prison, the proposed reformation, was an attempt to put her back in the box she'd escaped from, to make her manageable again, palatable, hidden. If she was defiant, she was labeled mad. If she was quiet, she was erased. If she was clever, she was dangerous. If she was successful, she was a threat. And so every response became more about society's discomfort than her actual actions. Hang her, not just to punish piracy, but to send a message. Marry her, not to save her, but to neutralize her. Reform her, not for her soul, but for their peace of mind. And yet, despite all of it, these women disrupted the story. They didn't just challenge authority at sea. They challenged it in the courtroom, in the press, and in the public imagination. They exposed how fragile the rules were, how easily power trembled when faced with someone who didn't accept the role assigned to her. They weren't heroes, but they weren't villains either. They were complicated, ruthless, brave, sometimes cruel, sometimes clever. They were survivors. They did what they had to do. And whether they pleaded pregnancy, traded secrets, or walked the scaffold with a grin, they carved a place for themselves in a world that didn't want them. Some went down with the ship. Others vanished into fog. A few, like Ching Shi, walked away richer than any admiral. But all of them, even the ones history tried to forget, left a scar, a tear in the tidy fabric of power, and centuries later we still feel it. They weren't meant to speak, but somehow they're still being heard. For all the stories we tell, of Anne Bonny glaring down judges, of Mary Red gripping a sword in disguise, of Ching Shi bargaining with empires, there are countless more we'll never know. Unnamed women, forgotten sailors, pirates who left no paper trail because the world never intended to write them in. History, it turns out, isn't just shaped by who lived and who died. It's shaped by who got remembered. And the ones who didn't shout the loudest, or the ones who didn't end their lives in a blaze of scandal or defiance, were quietly swept aside. Some were simply caught at sea, noted in a prison ledger, and then erased. Others were labeled accomplices, a word that distanced them from agency, from choice. It allowed the men in charge to pretend she wasn't a captain, wasn't a fighter, just a mistake caught in the wrong place. These women didn't write memoirs. Many couldn't read or write at all, and no one was waiting to record their last words or save their letters in dusty archives. So their stories bled into silence. Some may have died in dark cells with nothing but rats and disease for company. Others may have been sold into labor, disappeared into households, or quietly executed with no audience, no trial, no tale. And a few, perhaps the luckiest, escaped. They changed their names, covered their tattoos, and melted into the anonymity of a town that didn't ask questions. They may have married, raised children, grown old, their past sealed behind them like a locked chest on the ocean floor. But even their silence is a kind of legacy. It shows how deeply the system feared them, not because they stole, not because they killed, but because they disrupted the order. They refused to be what women were supposed to be. They were inconvenient. So they were edited out. And yet, the gaps they left behind, the missing records, the vague footnotes, whisper to us anyway. Like ghost ships on a misty horizon, they remind us that women didn't just witness history. They shaped it, sometimes openly, sometimes from the shadows. We may never know all their names, but their presence is still felt, between the lines, behind the myths, beneath the waves. When every other option had been exhausted, the rope, the prison, the convent, the marriage, and society still didn't know what to do with a woman who had lived outside its laws, there remained one last strategy: to turn her into something harmless, a proper lady, a tale of reform, a woman who'd been fixed. This wasn't redemption in the poetic sense. It wasn't some grand turning of the soul. It was performance, plain and simple, a transformation choreographed for the benefit of those in power. They couldn't let her go back to sea. That would suggest their system had failed, but they also couldn't keep her locked away forever. So they tried to overwrite her past with lace and obedience. A few were sent to religious homes, places with names like Refuge for Wayward Women, which, behind the pious language, were little more than glorified prisons with hymnals. There, women who once shouted commands across ship decks were told to reflect, to kneel, to learn silence. They were assigned needlework, taught prayer, fed on guilt. Some even had their hair shorn, a symbolic gesture to strip them of their identity. Their history wasn't just forgotten. It was deliberately buried under layers of repentance and grey wool skirts. And still, not all of them submitted. Some nodded politely, stitched quietly, and planned. There were whispers of women who vanished from these reform homes, slipping out into cities, taking new names, joining merchant crews under disguise. Others stayed and endured, but never forgot. They ran kitchens like they once ran ships. They raised daughters who asked too many questions. They raised sons who heard bedtime stories a little too full of adventure and cannon smoke. And some, remarkably, didn't need to sew or sing hymns or plead for mercy at all. They talked until the gallows wobbled. They gave names, places, smuggling routes. They flipped the very map of piracy upside down because they knew things the authorities were desperate to hear. Where a notorious captain docked in the winter, which merchants looked the other way, what codes were used for signals, what bribes worked in Havana, which coastal fortresses were hollowed out with rot. These women, some of them barely out of adolescence, sat in courtrooms with the composure of diplomats and sold information like treasure. Not because they were traitors to their crews, but because they were survivors. They understood leverage. They knew that in a world that wanted them dead, knowledge was the only sword left to draw. Some lied. It didn't matter. The courts didn't have time to fact-check. They were desperate to look effective, to show results. If a pirate said Blackbeard's ghost was hiding treasure in a haunted cove, someone was sent to check. And when the talking ended, when every secret had been spilled, some walked away free. No cell, no scaffold, just a final nod and a quiet departure. Maybe to a town far inland, maybe to another ship, maybe to a life of watching the sea only from the window, remembering what it felt like to command. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't romantic, but it was survival. Because in the end, not every pirate fought with a blade. Some used words, and some used silence. But for every woman who escaped the noose, for every pirate who bargained her way out with secrets or cunning, there were those who reached the end of the line. And when they did, the world turned out in force, not to mourn, but to watch. The female pirate's execution wasn't just a punishment. It was a spectacle of rare intensity. People traveled for miles, drawn not by justice but by curiosity, scandal, and the strange thrill of watching something forbidden meet its end. Children clung to parents' hands. Merchants sold pastries beside gallows. The air was thick with gossip. This wasn't just about death, it was theater.
But when the one walking to the scaffold was a woman, especially a woman who had commanded a crew, defied kings, and refused to be ashamed, the performance carried extra weight. It wasn't just her life being ended. It was a message. This is what becomes of a woman who steps out of line. She climbed the steps. The crowd held its breath. Some stood tall, calm, even smirking. A few delivered sharp last words that made the judges squirm and the crowd cheer. Others cried, collapsing into prayers and shaking hands. Some said nothing at all, not because they were afraid, but because they had already said everything they needed to with their lives. Even priests, there to offer final rites, sometimes found themselves ignored or scolded. One condemned pirate reportedly interrupted her confessor and told him to be more interesting. It was her last moment on Earth, and she didn't want to spend it bored. The state tried to choreograph these executions to control the narrative. But narratives are tricky things, because sometimes all it took was one final act of dignity, one fearless glance from the scaffold to turn punishment into legend. The crowd might come expecting a monster. Instead, they saw a person brave, unapologetic, alive even in the face of death. And that, more than anything, terrified the people in charge, because these executions were meant to erase. Instead, they immortalized. She was supposed to vanish with the drop. Instead, she remained not in flesh but in story, in the whispers passed along by those who watched, in the pamphlets sold the next morning. In the ink of ballads, sometimes sympathetic, sometimes scandalous. And no matter how many times the system tried to say, "This is the end," the legend always said otherwise. Because a pirate's death was never the end of her tale. Not when people still talked. Not when girls still whispered her name. Not when someone somewhere looked out at the sea and thought, if she did it, maybe I could too. What came after a pirate's death, or her disappearance, or her retreat into obscurity, was rarely controlled by the woman herself. Once she was gone, others took hold of her story. They rewrote it, polished it, distorted it. And almost always, they did so with ink-stained fingers and an agenda, men with quills who believed every woman must either be a tragedy, a temptress, or a warning. If she died young, her legend was tinged with sorrow, a beautiful wild thing undone by passion or bad luck. If she lived, her survival was cast as a fluke, or worse, a deception. If she had outwitted her captors, the tale suggested she'd only done so because of witchcraft, seduction, or some unnamed male ally. There was no room for her to be simply smart, or strategic, or strong. Nuance was a luxury they didn't offer women like her. Anne Bonny in these retellings became a whiskey-soaked caricature, red-haired and reckless, more costume than character. Mary Read was reduced to her partnership with Anne, the silent shadow to Anne's flame, never allowed her own narrative. And Qing Shi, the most successful of them all, became an exotic outlier, her brilliance dimmed behind layers of stereotype. Even the pirates whose names were lost became fictionalized, bent into tropes and recycled in cheap novels. Stories emerged of mysterious women at sea, always seductive, always doomed, always punished. The point was not to preserve the truth, but to warn. Step outside your role, and the world will invent a punishment for you, even if it has to do it after you're dead. Some of these tales were used to frighten girls into submission. Others were meant to entertain. But slowly, over centuries, something strange happened. The fear faded. And what remained, what survived all the edits and warnings, was admiration. Readers began to see past the distortions. They saw the determination, the defiance, the refusal to be small. These weren't just pirates. They were pioneers of disobedience. Women who didn't wait for permission, who didn't ask to be rescued, who lived boldly and paid dearly. And even in death, they refused to disappear. They stayed, in myths, in songs, in whispered retellings and half-true legends, not as monsters, not as martyrs, but as icons. After hearing about Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Qing Shi, and the others who managed to surface in the fog of history, it's natural to ask, why weren't there more like them? Why does it feel like there are only a handful of names? Were women truly so rare on the high seas, or were their stories simply pushed overboard? The short answer is buried under centuries of prejudice. The long answer is tangled in institutional walls built by maritime laws, cultural norms, and generations of fragile pride. Ships were more than just vehicles. They were floating microcosms of the world that built them. And that world was obsessed with male control. Most navies outright banned women on board, often citing superstition. They believed a woman at sea would anger the spirits or distract the crew. As if seasoned sailors could be undone by a pair of earrings and a confident stride. As if centuries of navigation could be derailed by a woman's voice drifting across the deck. And so the only way many women got aboard was in disguise. They flattened their chests, wrapped themselves in scarves, walked with heavier steps, and spoke in lower tones. They became shadows in their own lives, hiding who they were just to breathe the sea air. Some were never discovered. Others were unmasked, often at the worst possible moment. Discovery didn't bring respect. It brought exile, or worse. Women who were caught on board might be thrown overboard, imprisoned, or simply disappeared. Their ambition wasn't seen as daring, it was seen as dangerous. Even among pirates who supposedly lived outside the rules of society, misogyny remained stubborn. A man who murdered, looted, and betrayed his crew might be immortalized in song, but a woman who did the same, she was unnatural, a threat to the order, a creature to be feared or shunned. And if she was captured, the story was never hers to tell. Officials erased her identity. In court records, she became the accomplice, the woman taken at sea, or simply unidentified. If she spoke at her trial, her words were rarely recorded. If she died in prison, no one wrote it down. If she escaped, her name vanished like a whisper in a storm. And for those who never made it to court, who died before their stories could be twisted or told, history left them nothing. Not even a footnote. That silence wasn't an accident, it was policy. The system needed piracy to be a man's domain. A chaotic, violent space, yes, but one where men could still be in control. A woman with a sword disrupted the illusion. A woman with a crew shattered it. And so, they wrote her out. They wrote out the tavern girl who climbed aboard a merchant ship and never looked back. The widow who avenged her husband by turning pirate. The farmer's daughter who disguised herself to escape a life of servitude and ended up commanding a crew. They existed. We know they did, but we don't know their names. Not because they weren't brave enough to matter, but because they made the wrong people uncomfortable. So, what did happen to women who were caught? The truth is as chaotic as the seas they once ruled. Some were hanged, public reminders that no one, not even a woman, was beyond the law. Others were thrown into prison cells and forgotten. Some were forced into marriages meant to tame them. Others disappeared in the fine print of plea bargains, in the shadows of new lives, in the silence that follows survival. A few talked their way to freedom. One negotiated her way into the history books with a retirement plan most kings would envy. But the vast majority, they vanished, lost to records that never cared to learn their names, erased by a world that found them too strange to accept, too inconvenient to keep, too dangerous to remember. But their stories, or rather, the fragments that remain, tell us more than just what happened to them. They reveal how terrified the world was of them, because these were not just women who stole gold or fired muskets. They were women who refused to stay where society placed them. They defied geography. They ignored gender. They rejected the polite fiction of obedience. And when they were finally caught, the systems built to punish crime couldn't decide what to do with them, not because they were pirates, but because they were women who didn't ask permission. Hang her. That's too public, too provocative. Lock her up. She might become a martyr. Reform her. What if she refuses? Marry her. What man could keep her? Every response to these women was an improvisation, a flailing attempt to undo what couldn't be undone. A woman who had already written herself into a chapter meant only for men. And in that struggle, in that chaos of rope and robes, shackles and sermons, you can see a deeper truth. Their real crime wasn't piracy. It was defiance. Their existence alone disrupted the world's rules. And even if they were silenced, or forgotten, or reshaped into cautionary tales, the ripple they left behind never fully vanished. Because these women, rebellious, stubborn, and gloriously uncontrollable, didn't just exist in history. They challenged it. They rattled its bones. They screamed in its quiet halls. They forced it to confront something it didn't want to see. That power, once claimed, doesn't ask who you are. It only asks if you're willing to hold it. For centuries, we've been told that history belongs to the victors. But sometimes, it's not victory that earns a place in the story, it's survival. And sometimes it's not even survival. It's noise, defiance, the refusal to vanish. Because long after the ropes frayed and the ships rotted, long after the courts forgot their names and the writers turned them into metaphors, these women kept whispering through time. Their lives, buried under dust and distortion, still send tremors through the stories we thought we understood. They didn't fit the roles written for them, and for that they were hunted, judged, erased. But centuries later, their voices remain. Not loud, not clean, not always clear, but undeniable. These weren't perfect people. They stole, they killed, they lied. Some were cruel, some were brilliant, some were both. They weren't saints. But neither were the men beside them, and no one seemed to mind writing those stories. The difference is expectation. Men were expected to be violent, to chase power, to dominate. When they did, it was accepted, even admired. But when a woman picked up a pistol, when she stood on a deck and shouted orders, when she stared down the law without blinking, she broke the script. And that made her dangerous. So what happened to female pirates after capture? Some were punished. Some were pardoned. Some disappeared into gardens or convents or coastal towns with new names and old scars. A few left behind headlines. Most left behind nothing at all. But all of them, even the ones whose stories were never written down, left something bigger. They forced the world to look at its own rules and realize how easily they could be broken. They were a reminder that obedience is not destiny, that gender is not fate, that courage, once claimed, cannot be revoked by law or rope or silence. And sometimes, in the long, echoing corridors of history, the loudest sound isn't the crash of cannon fire. It's the voice that was never supposed to speak. Let's turn the compass back, far before Caribbean raids and Qing dynasty coastlines, to the place where the story of civilization first cracked open, ancient Sumer. Here, buried in the sands of Mesopotamia, history began not with steel or strategy, but with fermentation. Imagine standing in the sticky heat of a Sumerian city 4,000 years ago. You're not sipping cool water from a cup, you're holding a heavy clay mug of cloudy beer so thick it could pass for soup. It wasn't just a drink, it was survival. Barley was soaked, mashed, left to bubble and churn, a kind of alchemy guided by the gods. And one goddess above all watched over this ritual, Ninkasi, divine brewer, sacred fermenter, patron of buzzed farmers and temple priests alike. The Sumerians didn't just drink beer, they worshipped it. They wrote hymns about it, carved images of it into their walls, and they paid their workers with it. Up to 5 liters a day for hauling stone in the heat. Imagine clocking out of your shift and being handed your paycheck in a bucket you could drink. That's how essential it was. But perhaps the most striking detail, women brewed it. Brew mistresses ran the beer production in households, in temples, in palaces. They weren't assistants. They were authorities. Their hands shaped the mash, their recipes passed down generations. Before beer became an industry, it was a woman's craft, not just sacred, but skilled. And in a time where written records were few and female power even fewer, beer gave women a place in both. This was not just the beginning of alcohol. This was the beginning of women shaping the world through what they made, not what they were told to be. And it didn't stop there. As empires shifted and gods changed names, the drink changed too. Egypt turned beer into a national diet. The Greeks traded it for wine and poured their philosophy into goblets. The Romans turned every sip into politics and propaganda. But in every corner of the world, alcohol wasn't just sustenance. It was identity. It was ritual. It was resistance. It was revelation. And behind many of these early rituals, from temple feasts to household offerings, were women. Stirring vats, saying prayers, pouring into cups not just liquid but meaning. History would eventually try to wrest that power away, turn brewing into an industry, into a man's job, but the roots never forgot. They ran deep into the soil of ancient villages and sacred halls, where the first brewers weren't guilds or corporations, but women with smoke in their hair, barley under their nails, and gods watching from above. So now we arrive at the end, not just of the story, but of the silence it tried to shatter. From the fog-choked coasts of the Caribbean to the forgotten alleyways of ancient cities, we've traced the shadows of women who were never supposed to be remembered. Pirates who sailed outside the margins, rebels not only against kings and navies but against the very idea of what a woman was allowed to be. What happened to them after capture? Some were sentenced, some escaped. Some pleaded their bellies or married their way out. Others were silenced by disease or prison or simply by being too ordinary for legend. But all of them, every single one, forced the world to pause, to question, to hesitate. They made it clear that rebellion wears many faces, that history is not a clean timeline but a map full of erasures, of names scratched out, of voices dismissed. And yet here they are, still rattling the bones of the past, still smirking from between the lines. Their legacy isn't neat. It isn't polished. It wasn't built to inspire, and that's precisely why it does. They remind us that surviving a system meant to erase you is its own kind of victory, that history, no matter how carefully written, can never fully silence the people it tries hardest to forget. And that sometimes the loudest echo is not the boom of a cannon, it's a voice that refused to stay buried. These were women who bled into the fabric of history not through permission, but through persistence. They were pirates, and they were never supposed to speak, but they did, and we're still listening.